Welcome to the George C. Marshall Center's Strategically Speaking. This podcast series explores the future of NATO in an era of global change. Join us as experts shed light on the challenges and evolution of the Atlantic Alliance. Stay tuned for insightful discussions on international security and NATO's path forward.
A warm welcome to the Marshall Center's podcast series on NATO at 75, the future of the Atlantic Alliance in tumultuous times. I am Fritz Rademacher, Professor of International Security. Dear followers of our podcast series, we are truly honored to welcome a very special guest today. General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, kindly hosting us here at his headquarters, SHAPE, that's the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in Mons, Belgium. General, thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us and for being such a big supporter of the Marshall Center.
Thank you, Fritz.
We are recording this session on the 22nd of April, 2024. Admiral, could you please introduce our guest?
General Cavoli commissioned into the infantry in 1987 and has served in a wide variety of positions throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. Most recently, he commanded U.S. Army Europe from January 2018 to June 2022, during which time he also incorporated responsibilities for Army operations in Africa into his command's portfolio. Directly upon concluding that assignment, he assumed duties as Commander, U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Welcome, General. We are most pleased to be your guests today.
Thank you, Admiral. It's very nice to have you here. And before we even begin the discussion, I should point out what a pleasure it is to get to deal with the Marshall Center again. As you know, I'm an alumnus of the Marshall Center, and I'm also the Marshall Center's biggest fan. The work that you have done and continue to do to consolidate common mentalities regarding security issues in Europe and across the globe is very, very valuable to our alliance and therefore to all of us. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you indeed. This is much appreciated. And so let me start with the current security environment, which has been called many things: an age of disruption, an era of strategic simultaneity with multiple concurrent and interconnected threats, risks, and challenges, a time of systemic or strategic competition, to name just a few of the many buzzwords. What do you view as the biggest challenge to the security of the alliance in this day and age? What are your top three?
Great. Well, first of all, the top two are listed in NATO's strategic concept, which, as you knew, was updated just a couple of years ago, and in which we named adversaries for the first time in a long time. And heads of state and government got together and declared that there are two principal adversaries for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The first is terror groups, which we've had an unfortunate amount of experience with. And then the second is the Russian Federation. Clearly, the Russian Federation looms very, very large in our threat assessment right now. The almost hard to believe, unprovoked, illegal invasion of Ukraine is the dominant feature of the security landscape in Europe today, and it's the thing that we're all wrestling with. It's a conflict that's marked by a number of characteristics, but one of them, maybe the most salient, is scale. It's just a big war. Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting, thousands of armored vehicles destroyed, a dozen ships sunk, vast amounts of land ruined and destroyed by munitions and by the war. So this question of scale is really important in this fight, and it's driven by the Russian Federation's not just the size of their army, but also the way their army fights with using mass as one of its principal substitutes for actual tactics or operational skill. Which brings me to the third challenge, my number three, although some days it feels like it's my number one, And it's not an adversary, it's us. One of our biggest challenges is industrial production. So our alliance is scrambling to rearm after 40 years of enjoying the fruits of our labor the previous years in the Cold War. And it was an important time for our societies to have the opportunity to take the so-called peace dividend. But those days are over. And as we reorient and as nations commit more funds and more of their treasure to their armaments and to their militaries, we're discovering that our ability actually to produce high-end weaponry in large numbers on short schedules is not where we want it to be. And that is a very complex question. It has to do with reestablishing secure supply chains. It has to do with reestablishing secure relationships between governments and industry. It has to do with reestablishing the skill sets and the workforces necessary to operate and to develop and to produce high-end weaponry. But all of this needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved in short order. So that would be my number 3, although some days, as I said, it feels like my number 1.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. And it is the balance between quality and quantity that we have to get right here. Mass matters.
Absolutely. So, we've always, as an alliance and as individual nations in the alliance, we have tended to favor quality over quantity. And that's entirely appropriate for open democratic societies that don't want to be militarized. However, as was said, quantity has a quality all of its own, and we see that in the Russian military today. It's not a particularly skilled military at this point. They're especially their ground forces fight in a very unsophisticated fashion. They have some very exquisite technologies, and they incorporate those quite well. But the basic tactical and operational functioning of their land army is quite rudimentary. But it's big. And so we have to be able to contend with the size. We have greatly superior soldiers and greatly superior equipment. And we just have to apply it to solving that mass question.
General, thank you very much for your assessment of security landscape in Europe. Very, very fascinating. And especially that you brought the subject of industrial production and also quality versus quantity. This brings me to my next question, which is about the deterrence and defense, which NATO has begun to strengthen already in 2014 following Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea. These efforts were accelerated in scale, scope, and pace after Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. Can you describe what SACEUR has done and is doing in his area of responsibility to this end?
Sure, absolutely. This is maybe one of the most important things we can discuss this afternoon, because it's really fundamental. So in Madrid in 2022, heads of state and government got together, and they instructed SACEUR, my predecessor, Todd Walters at the time, to completely and immediately implement DDA. DDA is our strategic approach in the alliance, the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And it's a simple phrase, let's implement DDA, but the consequences have been enormous. And they have marked my entire time as SACEUR so far, which is coming up on the end of 2 years in a couple of months here. Why? Why have these 2 years been so momentous to implement DDA? Well, the first thing is DDA is about deterrence and defense of territory. It's about collective territorial defense of the property of the nations of the alliance. And that is completely different from what we had been doing previously. After the end of the Cold War, our last plans lapsed in the beginning of the 1990s, and then we went for a long period of time focusing on crisis management in out-of-area operations. Out-of-area operations are very specific. They tend to be smaller scale, a few ships, a few planes, maybe a brigade, smaller scale. They tend to be done at a time and place of our choosing. They're not imposed on us, but rather they're something we elect to do because they're far away. And therefore they happen on a predictable schedule. And so all of our military's optimized for that. All of our processes in NATO optimized for that. We optimize for these cyclical, repetitive, scheduled, predictable opportunities to employ small amounts of force. And we took economies every place we could. This is what produced the peace dividend, because we had no requirement for a standing force, just a rotational, cyclically generated force. We took economies every place else. Enablers above the brigade level, corps artillery and things like that, helicopter brigades. We took logistics. We took economies in that. We took economies in readiness. If you have 3 brigades, but only one is going to be deployed at once, that's the only one that needs to be fully ready. And we found enormous economies. All of our militaries did. Nothing could be more different from the task today. Now we are focused on collective territorial defense. We have the 3 regional plans that come under the DDA family of plans, and those are classic plans. Those are classic operational plans that show how we intend to defend specific pieces of geography with what forces, in what sequence of events, what are the key elements of terrain. All of that's laid out now. For the first time in 40 years, we have plans. But those plans are to defend our property, which we don't do on our schedule. We don't do on an optional basis. We do that when the threat presents itself. And so we have to have standing ready forces. So now instead of a cyclical force generation model, we've developed a new force model that has 3 tiers of readiness forces, so that we have some forces that are constantly ready to go at a moment's notice in the frontline states. We've also developed the forces, the description of the forces required to execute the plans. So in addition to a new force model and a readiness model, we now have a new force structure requirement. And that force structure requirement is finally, it's the blueprint that we've been missing. So for the first time in almost 35 years, we have a militarily sound, objective, plans-based requirement for forces. And now nations who are seeking to spend money to modernize their forces and to build their forces up have a blueprint, as it were. They see what are the things we need to be able to fight collectively to defend the territory of the nations of the alliance. And this is going through the NATO defense planning process right now, and is going to kick out capabilities targets that are designed for the first time in years, not just around future desired capabilities, but around our current plans as well. And so we worked very hard on the NDPP. We just did the minimum capability requirement, came through a couple of weeks ago. I salute ACT and SACT, General Philippe Lavigne, for the excellent work his staff has done with our staff on putting together a really solid description of force. But now we have the blueprint for what we have to build in the future. It's changing everything. We're changing C2 arrangements, our command and control arrangements, our exercise program, our alert and readiness system, our authorities. So the changes from that simple phrase in 2022, implement immediately DDA, have been very profound. They're very big changes for the alliance, for the operational force of the alliance, but I think they're necessary. If we go back to our opening comments about the problems we see in Europe and in the world today, I think it's very necessary for us to modernize our collective defense system to meet the current and foreseeable future demands.
Let me drill down on this a little bit. Last year at Vilnius, NATO leaders adopted the new family of defense plans that you mentioned. Can you give us your views on their execution, and perhaps also offer your assessment on what actually is needed when it comes to the eastern flank in terms of permanence, prepositioning, military mobility, and whatever else would fall under the enablement in the east.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So one of the great things about the regional plans, which are really the classical plans for defensive activity of the alliance, the regional plans have for the first time incorporated national defense plans inside them. So obviously it would be ridiculous for the alliance to go to country X, Y, or Z and say, this is how we're going to do it. The country already has a plan to defend itself. Article 3 demands that nations have a plan to defend themselves and the capability to defend themselves. So what we've done is work very closely with nations to understand their defense plans that are in place, and then to put next to that the NATO forces that are already in place. As you know, after the invasion of Ukraine, this most recent invasion of Ukraine, NATO stood up 4 additional battle groups, increased its air policing, has adopted a couple of other measures that have put more forces in the east. So now we have those forces next to national forces, and we've put their efforts together as the baseline day one beginning of the defense. And then we see how to reinforce after that. So the first and most important innovation is the integration of national plans and national personnel. And this is quite complicated because these are sovereign nations, right? And these are sovereign nations, and they're running their countries. You know, Admiral Poland wants to run Poland the Polish way, and NATO is there to work inside that context. So there's slightly different modalities of this across the eastern flank especially. But some things are just physically real, right? The requirement to reinforce means that we have to rehearse that, and we have to see which things need to be in place beforehand. I told you a few minutes ago that one of the economies nations took, our militaries took, was in logistics. And that shows now when we do this. And one of our biggest gaps, admittedly, is in our logistics. We need to strengthen our ability to move forces tactically as well as operationally and strategically. There's been a lot of work done on this, military mobility especially. The EU has a great program on that. We work closely with them to establish our requirements and everything. But the main work is by rehearsing. When we exercise at large scale over and over, we reveal the challenges that we still have. Some of them are infrastructural. Some of them are procedural. Some of them are, some battalions are better at putting their stuff on trains than others, and we have to get everybody to a high level. Some of them are purely planning. The military has a responsibility to put together the movement tables to do efficient movement. General Zolfrank down at the JSEC is doing a fantastic job with this, but it's a vast task. So those things have to happen too. What becomes obvious is that as much stuff as we can have forward as possible without overcommitting to any particular potential course of action will give us the amount of responsiveness and flexibility that we need. And this is where the requirement for prepositioning comes, where the requirement for additional infrastructure comes, and some of the other things that we see going on like this. There's nothing static in the security environment. There's nothing static in a military response to the security environment. And so we can expect, as we continue to train, as the threat grows or abates, as new technologies become apparent, we can expect to modify our plans and to shape our plans so that they're optimizing what is available for us and being as responsible as possible to produce the amount of deterrence we want. And the amount of deterrence we want, I think, is very significant right now. We want ironclad deterrence, and so that's what we're working toward.
Thank you very much.
General, in my question, when you were referring to deterrence and defense, you mentioned about command and control structure. So are there any adjustments needed to the C2 arrangements, or is current setup sufficient?
Yeah, no, this is again, great, very good questions. So to start with recent history, during the during the 3 decades that we focused on out-of-area operations, what was the role of NATO force structure? What was the role of the headquarters that we had? For instance, Corps headquarters, 3-star Army headquarters. Well, they were mainly used on a rotational basis to go run the command and control of an operation such as in Afghanistan. The IJC, the Joint Command in Afghanistan, was usually built around a NATO corps as its core, CORE. And so you had a rotational schedule table that showed, this year you'll be ready, you'll be getting ready. This year you'll deploy to Afghanistan. This year you'll stand down. Next year you'll do this, and you kind of rotated through that. So a corps was not associated with any specific piece of geography, nor was it associated with any specific units, subordinate organizations. And it was entirely appropriate for the kind of operations we were doing and for what we were doing, but it's completely inappropriate for large-scale territorial defense, right? I mean, you want headquarters now that, quote, own a piece of ground, that focus on that piece of geography, that understand the people there, that understand the infrastructure there, that understand the terrain there, that understand the adversary that's on the other side of the line facing them. You want geographic specificity and focus. And you don't want it to be available and ready only part of the time. You need them to be ready all of the time because they're front lines. Then you have others that will be reinforcing organizations, and those organizations will be able to move forward and reinforce. So they'll have a broader remit, but it will never be just on this cyclical basis. Again, it's just not the right model. So the first thing we're doing is we are redesigning the task structure for the NATO command structure and force structure that we already have. And using the corps as an example is a good place to start. We are going to assign specific corps to specific pieces of geography or to specific reinforcing missions. Then the next step is during force sourcing, where we solicit contributions to the force structure requirement from nations. We are going to match divisions and brigades and other formations to corps headquarters so that they can establish a relationship. And we have a variety of different levels of tightness of that relationship. We have affiliation, which is the loosest. We have apportionment. We have allocation. And nations get to choose, well, I would like to take these 2 brigades and affiliate them with that corps for this part of regional plan center, for example. This is going to be very, very powerful. This is going to give us the ability to practice together, to rehearse together, the sort of thing that was impossible when alliance militaries were essentially a large bucket filled with units from which we plucked some on occasion to send onto a mission. So this is a fundamental shift in the theory behind our command and control structures. But it also brings the practical change, like that corps is responsible for this area now. This is the case in a number of the other domains as well, right? We're increasing the number of maritime headquarters that we have so that we have enough command and control over the sea. A couple of important notes about command and control, things that are changing. The first is JFC Norfolk, which was brought into being a few years ago to cover the Euro-Atlantic part of the word Euro-Atlantic. The Atlantic part of it was to be covered by JFC Norfolk. We never really fully got them up and running, though. Now there is a crying need for that because having added significant landmass to the northern part of the alliance, 2 big Nordic countries have come in, and we'll need a command and control headquarters over them. But I've got to grow JFC Norfolk first. We've got to get them up to size and fit for purpose. And Admiral Perry's doing a great job working with nations right now to do that. So that's one of the outstanding things left to do in our command and control revision. The second is the reimagining of this headquarters, of SHAPE. During long years of out-of-area operations, SHAPE was not needed to manage actual battlefield dynamics because they were being handled by subordinate commands far away, and they were small in scale. But when we contemplate the simultaneous execution of all three regional plans, when we contemplate a continent-scale war, then clearly there has to be an organization that manages that entire theater, and that's the job of this headquarters. So, during the period of a lack of need for significant battlefield management out of SHAPE, SHAPE became an organization that was quite closely tied to Brussels and involved in a deep dialogue with Brussels, mainly on political military matters. And we're shifting that balance a little bit now to make sure that we have the mechanisms, the structures, the procedures, the architecture in place necessary for me to be able to use this headquarters to manage an entire theater of operations. The fighting will still be done by the JFCs in their respective areas, but managing the weight of effort across the theater is solely the job of this headquarters. And that's been a big change, too. I'm very proud of the amount of work that's been done. Our Chief of Staff here, Joachim Rühle, and our Vice Chief of Staff, Hubert Cottereau, have been doing a fantastic job converting this headquarters into SHAPE as a warfighting headquarters.
Thank you very much, General. Very interesting assessment. And it just hit me that when we talk about the security environment in Europe and the needs that we need to face, we usually talk about our adversaries and technical arrangements, structures, and so on. But at the beginning of our discussion, we were talking about peace dividend. How do you view the military culture? Do we need to change our military culture because we might have the whole generation of soldiers used to out-of-area deployments only?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that military cultures will need to shift. I think most nations' militaries are already halfway down that road. It is a big change. It's a question of constant readiness, not cyclical readiness. It's a question of large scale, not bespoke. There is a specific adversary to look at. So the changes are significant. However, I think we are more than ready for the task and more than eager to shift that culture. I frequently tell people that the amount of talent that nations send to this headquarters is incredible to me. I am in awe of it every day. The officers who are in this headquarters, the senior non-commissioned officers in this headquarters, are the very best their nations have to offer. They are eager to get after this. They are eager to reestablish this capability because it's vital to their individual nations and to us collectively. So while there will be mentality change and things like that, I am not afraid of it, and I think it's going to happen naturally because the professionals in this alliance desire it and see the need.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I'd like to shift the discussion towards the war that is being waged in Europe, Russia's war of aggression against its neighbor. Ukraine is facing a tough situation as we are moving into the third year of the war. What is actually your assessment of the situation and what needs to be done in support of Kiev?
Fritz, I think the first thing that we should do is acknowledge the scale and the significance of the accomplishment of the Ukrainians in the past 2 years. By almost all professional estimates, this was to have been a short, sharp war, and it was not going to be in the Ukrainians' favor. Completely the opposite has taken place. And while the situation this week on the battlefield may be tough, and while we've certainly gotten into a protracted attritional type of conflict right now, I think that our starting point in any discussion about this should be to remark on what an incredible achievement the brave and clever Ukrainian military has pulled off, and the Ukrainian nation has pulled off in the past 2 years. But they need a lot of help. They need a lot of help. They are dependent on us. They're dependent on external sources for their munitions, for their equipment, for repair of that equipment, for almost everything. They are trying very hard to build their own indigenous industrial capacity right now. It's tough. It's hard to run a factory when there's bombs hitting it. A lot of their principal heavy industry was in the east and has been in some of the areas of the hardest fighting, cities like Kharkiv. But nonetheless, they persist, and they're putting together, their own ability to generate munitions, their own ability to generate armored vehicles. I think that's very positive. But in the meantime, they're still dependent on us. So what do we do? I think you're aware. We operate this right now through a spontaneous coalition of like-minded countries, originally called the Ramstein Group because it met for convenience at an air base in Ramstein, Germany. It's a group of folks convened by my boss, by Secretary Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense. About every 6 weeks, we come together. It's a little bit more than 50 nations right now. 50 ministers of defense or their direct representatives show up, and we have discussions with our Ukrainian colleagues. We do an update on the battlefield, and then we lay out what physical and material requirements that the Ukrainians have. And then nations sign up to provide them stuff. Nations will say, we're going to send, 25 tanks next month. And it's quite remarkable. Then we have a pretty intricate process for delivering assistance to the Ukrainians. But this all happens outside of NATO structures. It's a coalition. It's not the alliance doing it. It's when I say we deliver stuff to them, I'm talking about me as the commander of U.S. EUCOM, my other job, working with representatives and assistants from other nations that have signed up to do it. Now, truth be told, most of those nations are NATO nations, and most NATO nations are involved in that. But it's a coalition of the willing. It's not a directed alliance activity. So I think that's the most important thing we can do right now, right? We can continue to provide them material support, the Ukrainians. Close second, however, a close second behind providing material support is continuing to provide political and moral support. Those who've been in wars know that wars they wear you down. They're hard. Look at this continent, not so many decades ago. Wars are hard. They wear people down. They wear populations down. The Ukrainians have been at this for 2 years. 2 years straight, and they haven't gone anyplace. They're still there. It's still the same Ukrainians putting up with the same war. They could use the sure knowledge that we're on their side. We're with them. It's got to be demonstrated, but it's also got to be said. We have to constantly say that to each other, and we have to remind our own populations that this is important as well. Right? It's not just reassuring our Ukrainian friends. It's also making sure that our populations don't become distracted, look off after something more pleasant to look at, and forget the urgency of this moment. We're not transforming the collective defense mechanisms of this alliance just for fun. We're doing it because there's an urgent need. Those two threats, those two adversaries, especially the Russian adversary, those are real. Imminent, and we have to prepare for them. So it's important for us to remind our populations as well. So I would say close behind continuing the material support that we're giving the Ukrainians is continuing the moral and political support for them.
Thank you.
I'd like to stay with the subject of the war in Ukraine and look at it from a little bit different angle. The Putin regime has been, how can I say, very generous about nuclear rhetoric. Already in 2014, and even more so now. And this also ties with the societies that you have just mentioned seconds ago. What do you make out of it?
Yeah, your clever formulation, generous with nuclear rhetoric. Two words that don't typically go together. I think a few things are worth observing. The first is that nuclear deterrence has held. It's important to remember that, despite all of the talk, despite fears and everything, deterrence has held and continues to hold. And the nuclear deterrent of this alliance has held and continues to hold. It's very important. People forget sometimes that NATO is a declared nuclear alliance, and our collective deterrence is an important part of why deterrence has held so far. But it must be recognized that the strategic stability paradox that we saw during the Cold War continues to exist. That is, the strategic deterrence at the strategic level that keeps us from launching weapons at each other, in some strange way, in a paradoxical way, actually creates a space for local non-strategic instability to exist. And that's exactly what we saw throughout the Cold War. It's what we see in Ukraine today. So while strategic nuclear deterrence is necessary, it does not solve everything, because instability can exist below the strategic level. And so we have to be ready to deal with that as well. That's why we have our conventional forces, and that's why we have conventional military activity. Now, one could connect those by using smaller yield nuclear weapons, the so-called tactical nukes, etc. We haven't seen that yet. We haven't, because I think that no matter what anybody's doctrine says, no matter what anybody's theories of war say, I think that the world, everybody in the world, recognizes that is a line that is very, very, very dangerous to cross. It's not just a bigger bomb. It's not just a bigger firecracker. And so I think that that realization has been part of why deterrence has held at multiple different echelons throughout this. I think that it's very safe to say that nations probably fell out of the practice and the habit of thinking about nuclear weapons and thinking about nuclear deterrence as an active thing. And I think nations have very quickly reoriented themselves on it, relearned the theories, updated our ability to signal each other and to read the other side's signals. And I know that in the alliance, we have certainly been working on raising the nuclear IQ, as it were, because we need to be educated and familiar with these things if we are going to deter, which is, of course, our goal.
General, as we're coming to the end of the interview, allow me one last question. For, I think, good reasons, we are emphasizing gender balance and women, peace, and security in our programs at the Marshall Center. Now, how long until we will have the first female SACEUR?
Well, another year, I hope. Honestly, unless I'm being fired. That's a great question. I don't know. It's a question for nations, right? It's a question for nations. So the way SACEUR typically is chosen, it's a 4-star from the United States who's nominated by the United States to be the commander of U.S. European Command. That's an entirely U.S. decision. And then that officer's name and background is submitted to the North Atlantic Council for consideration, and nations have the opportunity to accept or not accept that officer. So I know the process, but I don't know the inside of that, and I'm not sure when there'll be a female SACEUR or who the next SACEUR will be even.
Thank you very much. It has been such a privilege to engage with you today, and we are most grateful to you for taking your time, for your insights, for your perspectives, and for everything you're doing, be it as Commander EUCOM for your nation or as Supreme Allied Commander Europe for the Alliance and all of us. So thank you for your leadership, and we wish you every success in the discharge of your many duties. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to all our listeners. Please stay tuned for the next episodes as we will continue to explore the Alliance's future with senior leaders and officials from NATO and allied and partner countries. Until the next time, goodbye from us, Fritz Rademacher
and Rear Admiral Piotr Niec.
Thank you for joining us on Strategically Speaking, presented by the George C. Marshall European Center for Strategic Studies. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of the George C. Marshall Center, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. We hope today's episode provided valuable insights into NATO's role in today's world. For more content, visit our website at www.marshallcenter.org. Join us next time for more on the unfolding story of NATO.